The last civilization we'll look at in the Americas was not a Mesoamerican civilization, but a South American civilization, and that's the Inca Empire. The Inca were different from the other cultures in where they were. Mesoamerica, as we said, is pretty warm, either rainforest or a semi-arid climate. But in South America, in the Andes Mountains, where the Inca were from, things are really different. You've got these really steep mountain peaks. You have somewhat extreme climates. The further up you go, the colder it gets. The further down you go, the more temperate it is. But like Mesoamerica, there aren't any major rivers. Rainfall can be irregular. So it's kind of a challenging place to build a civilization. But nevertheless, the Inca were able to do so. One other difference with the Andes compared to Mesoamerica is that people in the Andes weren't really city builders. There were many different cultures, like the Nazca and the Chan Chan people, but there weren't that many big cities. Most people were living in villages and towns. And the only major city here was the Incan city of Cusco, which was originally its own kingdom. But around 1438, one of the kings of Cusco decided to try and expand his power. And that's what started the Inca Empire. And over the course of the next century or so, they expanded across almost the entirety of the Andes Mountains. The Inca didn't call themselves an empire. They called themselves Tawantinsuyu, which means the realm of four parts. And you can see how the empire was divided into four different provinces. But they're all administered from the capital of Cusco, seen here partly in a reconstruction. The ruler of the Inca Empire was the Sapa Inca, which means only Inca. The first Sapa Inca to start expanding Cusco into an empire was Pachacuti. And the way the Inca expanded was really kind of through construction. You can see how impressive their stonework is. Keep in mind, they really didn't have steel tools. They didn't use any mortar in their brick. All this is carved stone. You can see, too, here in Machu Picchu, which wasn't a city, but more like an imperial royal retreat. So by constructing these things, they sort of exercised their power that way. One of those more important constructions was the construction of a road system. The Inca had roads that covered the entirety of their empire, and you can see they are made sort of this cobblestone. It's not made for carts or animals because the American peoples didn't really domesticate any animals aside from llamas, which are too small to carry people. So instead, the Inca used these runners called chasqui who could carry messages across the entirety of the empire. So even just seen in using these roads, people were reminded of the power of the Inca to be able to create such constructions. The Inca Empire was organized into groups called Ailu. This is a system that was common throughout the Andes Mountains. Even today, people still practice this, where people group themselves by families, by villages, by regions of villages. And essentially, people in the Ailu are responsible for each other. It's a shared property. If you're injured, the other people of the Ailu are expected to take care of you. People would collectively educate and raise their children. And this is a way the Inca used to organize their empire. People or men in Ailu would be taxed in a system called mita. Mita is a different kind of tax compared to what we might think of as a tax, and that it wasn't it wasn't a currency. There was no currency in the Inca Empire. Instead, people paid their tax by working. The government would require men from an Ailu to work on a certain project, maybe a temple or a road or a farm. And by doing that, the Inca were able to have a reliable source of labor. It's not that unusual when you think about it. When the government taxes you, they're taking money you got from working. Here, the government just takes your work directly for a certain portion of the year. So this is another way the Inca were able to exercise their power. They also exercised their power through language. The Inca spoke a language called Quechua, which is actually still spoken by Andean people today. And by having a common language throughout the empire, they're able to communicate better with people. They didn't have a written language, unlike the Maya, but they did have a record-keeping system called Quipu. Quipu are sets of strings and colored knots. And this is a really unique record-keeping system we see only in the Andes. And Quipu were used to communicate, to store records. It could be simple things like census data. There's some evidence they may even record, narrative and story. Most Quipu were destroyed after the Spanish arrived, and the knowledge of those Quipu actually died out. But some people use varieties of Quipu today in the Andes Mountains. The Inca had to feed their empire, of course, and Incan agriculture was also fairly well developed. They domesticated llamas and alpacas, both as a source of wool and textiles, and also as a source of meat. The main crops they grew were potatoes, which are native to the Andes, and maize or corn, which they had brought from Mesoamerica, or had introduced from there. Of course, it's challenging when you have the kind of environment the Inca were in to reliably grow crops. You can imagine trying to farm on a mountainside. So the Inca developed this terrace system. Terrace farming is not that uncommon. You see it in other parts of the world like Africa and Southeast Asia, where hillsides are carved out into these steps that creates more flat land to farm on. But Incan terraces were unique in that they really kind of relied on the kinds of climates that change as you go higher and lower in elevation. So these were sort of designed so that in the lowest part it was actually significantly warmer than the higher parts, and humidity would change as well. And this allowed the Inca to grow different crops and different varieties of crops at different elevations. So that made sure they had a reliable food source throughout the empire. Religion was important in the Inca Empire. Now, this was not a heterogeneous or this was a heterogeneous or diversified empire, so there were lots of different gods that were worshipped. But the Inca, the Sapa Inca, the ruler himself, was considered to be the son of Inti, the sun god. And that sun god played an important role. There was a large temple in Cuzco dedicated to Inti that was actually filled with gold statues and gold inlay. And the emperor often played important parts in religious ceremonies. Priests, you can see in this recreation, also were considered higher class, and they were relied on partly to govern. So even though there was some exercise of religious independence in the Inca Empire, they used religion as a way to exercise and centralize their power. From Pachacuti, you had a number of emperors, but the last really powerful emperor was a guy named Huayna Capac, ruling in the early 16th century. And Capac died rather suddenly. He fell ill, and he had appointed a successor, his eldest son, but within a month or so of him taking the throne, he also died. Incans at the time weren't really sure what this disease was, although a lot of historians today think it was smallpox, which had been introduced when the Spanish arrived, first in the Caribbean and then later into Central America. So the priests of Cuzco came together and the nobility came together, and they appointed as ruler one of his other sons, Huascar. There was another son, Atahualpa, who was also sort of in the running, and so to sort of put him aside, they made Atahualpa governor of Cuzco. Huascar was not very trusting of his brother, afraid he would overthrow him, so soon a civil war broke out. And this really devastated the Inca Empire because it was divided now. You had this disease going around. Eventually, Atahualpa was the victor, and Huascar was exiled. But right about this time, the Spanish arrive, Francisco Pizarro and his conquistadors. And this really leaves the Inca very vulnerable to Pizarro, who was there looking for gold and looking for conquest. We'll talk more about how the Spanish were able to overcome the Inca later. But kind of the key takeaway is how the Inca were able to build this really complex, centralized, and advanced culture